to the red nucleus and, after decussating with the corresponding fasciculus of the opposite side, ends in the interpeduncular ganglion. The pineal body, corpus pineale epiphysis, is a small, conical, reddish-gray body which lies in the depression between the superior colliculi. It is placed beneath the splenia of the corpus callosum, but is separated from this by the telechoroidea of the third ventricle, the lower layer of which envelops it. It measures about 8 millimeters in length, and its base, directed forward, is attached by a stalk or peduncle of white substance. The stalk of the pineal body divides anteriorly into two laminae, a dorsal and a ventral, separated from one another by the pineal recess of the third ventricle. The ventral lamina is continuous with the posterior commissure. The dorsal lamina is continuous with the habendular commissure and divides into two strands, the medullary striae, which run forward, one on either side, along the junction of the medial and upper surface of the thalamus to blend in front with the columns of the fornix. The posterior commissure is a rounded band of white fibers crossing the middle line on the dorsal aspect of the upper end of the cerebral aqueduct. Its fibers acquire their medullary sheaths early, but their connections have not been definitively determined. Most of them have their origin in a nucleus, the nucleus of the posterior commissure, nucleus of Darkschwitz, which lies in the central gray substance of the upper end of the cerebral aqueduct, in front of the nucleus of the oculomotor nerve. Some are probably derived from the posterior part of the thalamus and from the superior colliculus, while others are believed to be continued downward into the medial longitudinal fasciculus. The hypothalamus includes the subthalamic tegmental region and the structures forming the greater part of the floor of the third ventricle, that is, the corpora mammillaria, tuber cinereum, infundibulum, hypophysis, and optic chiasma. The subthalamic tegmental region consists of the upward continuation of the tegmentum. It lies on the ventrolateral aspect of the thalamus and separates it from the fibers of the internal capsule. The red nucleus and the substantia nigra are prolonged into its lower part. In front, it is continuous with the substantia nominata of Meinert, medially with the gray substance of the floor of the third ventricle. It consists from above downward of three strata. 1. Stratum dorsale, directly applied to the undersurface of the thalamus and consisting of fine longitudinal fibers. 2. Zona incerta, a continuation forward of the formatio reticularis of the tegmentum. And 3. The corpus subthalamicum, nucleus of Lewis, a brownish mass presenting a lenticular shape on transverse section and situated on the dorsal aspect of the fibers at the base of the cerebral peduncle. It is encapsulated by a lamina of nerve fibers and contains numerous medium-sized nerve cells, the connections of which are not as yet fully determined. The corpora mammillaria, corpus albicontia, are two round white masses, each about the size of a small pea, placed side by side below the gray substance of the floor of the third ventricle, in front of the posterior perforated substance. They consist of white substance externally and gray substance internally, the cells of the latter forming two nuclei, a medial of smaller and a lateral of larger cells. The white substance is mainly formed by the fibers of the columns of the fornix, which descend to the base of the brain and end partly in the corpora mammillaria. From the cells of the gray substance of each of the mammillary bodies, two fasciculi arise. One, the thalamo-mammillary fasciculus, bundle of Vic d'Azur, passes upward into the anterior nucleus of the thalamus. The other is directed downward into the tegmentum. Afferent fibers are believed to reach the corpus mammillaria from the medial lemniscus and from the tegmentum. The tuber cinereum is a hollow eminence of gray substance situated between the corpora mammillaria behind and the optic chiasma in front. Laterally, it is continued with the anterior perforated substance and anteriorly with the thin lamina, the lamina terminalis. From the undersurface of the tuber cinereum, a hollow conical process, the infundibulum, projects downward and forward and is attached to the posterior lobe of the hypophysis. In the lateral part of the tuber cinereum is a nucleus of nerve cells, the basal optic nucleus of Meinert, while close to the cavity of the third ventricle are three additional nuclei. Between the tuber cinereum and the corpora mammillaria, a small elevation with a corresponding depression in the third ventricle is sometimes seen. Retzius has named it the eminentia sacularis and regards it as a representative of the saccus vasculosus found in this situation in some of the lower vertebrates. The hypophysis, pituitary body, is a reddish-gray, somewhat oval mass measuring about 12.5 mm in its transverse and about 8 mm in its anterior-posterior diameter. It is attached to the end of the infundibulum and is situated in the fossa hypophyseos of the sphenoidal bone, where it is retained by a circular fold of dura mater, the diaphragma sella. This fold almost completely roofs in the fossa, leaving only a small central aperture through which the infundibulum passes. Optic chiasma. Chiasma opticum, optic commissure. The optic chiasma is a flattened and somewhat quadrilateral band of fibers situated at the junction of the floor and anterior wall of the third ventricle. Most of its fibers have their origins in the retina and reach the chiasma through the optic nerves, which are continuous with its anterior lateral angles. In the chiasma, they undergo a partial decussation. The fibers from the nasal half of the retina decussate and enter the optic tract of the opposite side, while the fibers from the temporal half of the retina do not undergo decussation, but pass back into the optic tract of the same side. Occupying the posterior part of the commissure, however, is a strand of fibers, the commissure of Guden, which is not derived from the optic nerves. It forms a connecting link between the medial geniculate bodies. Optic tracts. The optic tracts are continued backward and lateralward from the posterior lateral angles of the optic chiasma. Each passes between the anterior perforated substance and the tuber cinereum, and, winding around the ventrolateral aspect of the cerebral peduncle, divides into a medial and a lateral root. The former comprises the fibers of Guden's commissure. The lateral root consists mainly of afferent fibers which arise in the retina and undergo partial decussation in the optic chiasma as described. But it also contains a few fine efferent fibers which have their origin in the brain and their terminations in the retina. When traced backward, the afferent fibers of the lateral root are found to end in the lateral geniculate body and pulvinar of the thalamus, and in the superior colliculus, and these three structures constitute the lower visual centers. Fibers arise from the nerve cells in these centers and pass through the occipital part of the internal capsule under the name of the optic radiations to the cortex of the occipital lobe of the cerebrum, where the higher or cortical visual center is situated. Some of the fibers of the optic radiations take an opposite course, arising from the cells of the occipital cortex and passing to the lower visual centers. Some fibers are detached from the optic tract and pass through the cerebral peduncle to the nucleus of the oculomotor nerve. These may be regarded as the afferent branches for the sphincter pupillae and ciliaris muscles. Other fibers have been described as reaching the cerebrum through the superior peduncle, while others again are lost in the pons. The third ventricle, ventriculus tertius. The third ventricle is a median cleft between the two thalami. Behind it, it communicates with the fourth ventricle through the cerebral aqueduct, and in front with the lateral ventricles through the interventricular foramen. Somewhat triangular in shape, with the apex directed backwards, it has a roof, a floor, an anterior and a posterior boundary, and a pair of lateral walls. The roof is formed by a layer of epithelium which stretches between the upper edges of the lateral wall of the cavity and is continuous with the epithelial lining of the ventricle. It is covered by and adherent to a fold of pia mater, named the telochoroidea of the third ventricle, from the undersurface of which a pair of vascular fringe processes, the choroid plexuses of the third ventricle, project downward, one on either side of the middle line, and invaginate the epithelial roof into the ventricular cavity. The floor slopes downward and forward and is formed mainly by the structures which constitute the hypothalamus. From before backwards, these are the optic chiasma, the tuber cinereum and infundibulum, and the corpus mammillaria. Behind the last, the floor is formed by the interpeduncular fossa and the tegmenta of the cerebral peduncles. The ventricle is prolonged downward as the funnel-shaped recess, the recessus infundibuli, into the infundibulum, and to the apex of the latter, the hypophysis, is attached. The anterior boundary is constituted below by the lamina terminalis, a thin layer of gray substance stretching from the upper surface of the optic chiasma to the rostrum of the corpus callosum, above by the columns of the fornix and the anterior commissure. At the junction of the floor and anterior wall, immediately above the optic chiasma, the ventricle presents a small angular recess or diverticulum, the optic recess. Between the columns of the fornix and just above the anterior commissure is a second recess termed the vulva. At the junction of the roof and anterior wall of the ventricle, and situated between the thalami behind and the columns of the fornix in front, is the interventricular foramen, foramen of Monro, through which the third communicates with the lateral ventricles. The posterior boundary is constituted by the pineal body. posterior commissure